I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. Chinese nation-state actors were observed using Anthropic's Claude Code generative AI coding assistant in an espionage campaign first discovered in mid-September, according to a report from Anthropic released on November 13th. Ali Pluchinsky, RANE's cyber analyst, is here to explain the implications for this cyber espionage campaign. Hi, Ali. How are you?
Hey, Emma. Great to be here.
Great to have you back on. So this is the first ever fully AI-automated cyber espionage campaign by a state-sponsored actor that we know of. How is it similar to and different from previous campaigns that we've seen from China?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emma. And to give our listeners a little bit of context, I think it's important to note that since this report came out and since, these claims that Anthropic made, there's been some discussion among the cybersecurity community, because whenever we talk about a new precedent, of course, first ever is sort of can be a difficult term to ascertain. And we've definitely seen reports prior to now of state-sponsored groups from not only China, but a few other countries leveraging AI in various components of their campaigns. I think what is really notable about this campaign that Anthropic is still getting to is the fact that the vast majority of it appeared to be automated. China is a notorious, or I should say prolific, cyber espionage oriented country. The vast majority of China's threat activity that targets the West is primarily non-disruptive and really aimed at sort of gaining access into Western networks, whether it's the public sector for just stealing that, sensitive intelligence from other governments, or the private sector for corporate espionage and the theft of intellectual property or other corporate strategic secrets that could be helpful to China's domestic economic ambitions. But back to the report and just this aspect of, AI automation. I mean, the Anthropic's description of the report was that human operators were still integral to this process, but, really were mostly overseeing and engaging in the strategic aspects of the campaign, such as choosing the target, whereas they were able to leverage Claude, which of the many chatbot services available is quite known for being oriented more towards the coding community and really great for different types of coding projects. So it was more so that the threat actors could offload or automate a lot of the other aspects of the campaign that ultimately take time and resources, whether it's that vulnerability detection and, initial intrusion to network mapping and lateral movement, to ultimately either malware prepositioning or deployment. And so looking ahead into 2026, we can get to this discussion in a moment, but the term agentic AI is becoming increasingly commonplace, and I think that there's a lot of confusion and conflation with how a lot of terms in this field are being used right now because of its nascency and also the intersection of companies advertising products and versus, what these tools really do. But I think it is a precedent that we now, have and are probably going to see more of. And this is consistent, again, with other reports that we've seen over the last year and really since the initial explosion of popularity in large language model-based products from ChatGPT in, November 2022. But I'll stop there for a moment.
Can you talk about the impacts of this campaign and what the major incentives and constraints shaping China's overall strategy with these campaigns are?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, in this campaign and frequently in other reports, Anthropic did not disclose which companies specifically were targeted, but they did disclose that about 30 companies were targeted, and it included tech companies, financial firms, manufacturing companies, government agencies. So we know that these are high-value targets, and this is I guess, worrisome from the Western standpoint because, again, China already has a robust, different arsenal of methods that it gains access into Western organizations and to target critical government agencies. Again, we've seen numerous reports over the course of this past year of explosive allegations against China for sweeping cyber espionage campaigns into the U.S. government agencies, NATO, and just Anglophone countries. But given the scope and pace, or I should say tempo, of Chinese threat activity already, I think the big implication of this, new campaign or precedent, if we really want to call it that, is that now, the pace and scope of these Chinese-based campaigns are going to become even faster and more automated. And China historically has been, again, very non-disruptive, unlike some of the other countries that have, I should say, tenser relations with the West, like Russia or Iran. China's still very integrated into the larger global economic system. It doesn't really want to be caught up in a game of escalation that could lead to economic or diplomatic retaliation from Western countries. And so, again, I think China, for at least the short term, is going to really try and infuse AI into the things that it's already good at, which are cyber espionage campaigns, but also to improve in some of the areas where it has historically demonstrated weakness. I think one great area one interesting area that we're thinking about for the future is around influence operations. In Microsoft's annual defense report, which is fairly substantive and authoritative given, Microsoft's role in the larger cybersecurity community, it really identified an uptick in Chinese efforts to expand its influence operations and to target not only more regional audiences, but also Western audiences. And if our listeners are, familiar with the constant talk of disinformation on social media platforms, especially around election periods, Russia is usually the culprit, and Russia has had a tendency to be pretty good at targeting Western audiences, and some of the reasons behind that, people believe, are just because there's some of those closer cultural similarities between Russia and Europe, for example, closer time zones, whereas China's efforts to engage in influence operations and target, the United States have been historically hindered by major differences in time zones, major differences in language, and then again, just major cultural and societal differences that have made their efforts at influence operations, really weak. But China and the other big four, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, which is a colloquial term that we group these together as sort of the more aggressive countries in cyberspace, have all been observed sort of trying to adopt AI to close some of the gaps when it comes to those challenges, such as, improving social media posts that are, grammar proof and consistent with whatever Western audiences would want to read or otherwise consume. And so, again, looking ahead into 2026, I think we're looking to see how China could try to adopt AI into those operations. And again, the midterms will be an interesting time to see whether or not we do see a bit of an improvement in those operations.
you've touched on this a little bit, but how impactful do you think this automating cyber espionage campaigns, this capability will be for other Big Four countries and also non-Big Four countries?
Yeah, I mean, again, AI as just what it is as a tool is, a force multiplier and magnifier. And so the reason that we focus on the Big Four is just because they're already, the among the most prolific and sophisticated in cyberspace. And so their adoption of AI is, can be perceived as more worrisome because they're already, so considered so advanced in terms of their technical prowess that a further improvement on that is, definitely going to be a challenge in the future for the West. And, I think in the case, North Korea is interesting, for example, because North Korea's whole focus in cyberspace, unlike China, which is so focused on stealing, again, that vital intellectual property that could fuel its homegrown competitive sectors, North Korea is really interested in stealing money from the West, getting access to companies that it can then either extort or, again, steal intellectual property more for the sake of, again, revenue generation, given the fact that North Korea really can't receive or generate revenue in other ways, given how sanctioned it is. And so over the course of this year and the last few years, we've seen North Korea really try and have different units or groups gain access or work opportunities at Western companies or firms, typically through remote work opportunities, which of course became more prominent after the COVID-19 pandemic. And whereas in the past, it would be presumably more challenging for a threat group or actor to pass the interview process at a Western company with the use of synthetic media tools that are available now. People, that the average person can translate their voice, they can mask what their voice sounds like, they can cover what their appearance looks like. And so for Western companies, this makes it much more challenging when they're trying to vet employees and prevent insider threats that could lead to extortion. And then when we talk about the other Big Four, Russia and Iran are a lot less risk averse comparatively. And so I think, they will also be purveyors of AI in the social engineering space for cyber espionage campaigns, as far as trying to generate these influence operations, either regionally or targeting the West during those critical periods, whether it's elections or in the aftermath of crises. One example, I think our audience is probably familiar with the countless reports that we've heard of Russian meddling in U.S. elections, but we've also seen Iran become a bigger participant in the information space in the aftermath of domestic crises. And, we had incidents including widespread backlash and protests in Sweden in the summer of 2023 over Quran burnings that later cybersecurity firms said, Iran attempted to inflame through the dispersion and proliferation of disinformation during that period. So again, with the use of AI, you have to ask yourself how these countries that already are more aggressive in the cyber realm could find use cases for their threat operations. And I should be clear that while we've talked about all of these non-disruptive use cases, more, the influence operations and cyber espionage campaigns, I mean, in the case of countries like Russia and Iran that have been engaged in recent conflicts, we've seen much more disruptive and destructive toolkits used by them in the cyber realm that have ranged from industrial control system malware, data wiper malware, highly sophisticated ransomware. And so we're definitely going to see the integration of AI for advancing those kinds of tools that, once deployed on, targeted systems, either render them totally inoperable, destroy databases, and lead to, huge supply chain disruptions. I mean, recently, a ransomware attack targeting Jaguar Land Rover, put it out of business for weeks and resulted in, I think, an estimated $220 million loss for the company. It forced the UK government to get involved, and that was a non-state, cyber attack or believed to be. So that again, raises the question of, over the long term, how we see countries like Iran and Russia, and this isn't to prohibit the idea that China in the future could also, engage in those more disruptive activities. Again, it has a lot more constraints on its willingness to do that in the short term, but there are friction points that China has with the West, whether it's over these economic relationships or, Taiwan's independence. And given the fact that it's already so prolific throughout Western networks, there is the question of how it may seek to, in the future, deploy malware and what that could look like. In the coming years, AI will accelerate and make more sophisticated all of these pre-existing trends. So I think Western businesses will, there's a lot of talk about this idea that we're going to have to fight AI with AI. And I think that that's probably true for Western businesses as well, or what the inevitable approach will be for cyber defense. This sounds, I guess, very gloomy when we finish on the note a few seconds ago, but, there have been a lot of improvements as well by companies like Google and Microsoft and these other leaders in cyberspace to develop AI tools that are also closing the gaps with, malicious actors. We've seen a tool that can help cyber defenders find zero-day vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that an organization doesn't know about quicker than, the average employee could do. And so, I don't want to end on a negative note. I think that there's also a lot of positive use cases where we're going to see really interesting uses for AI to also defend systems. So never fear. But
never fear is right.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Allie. Always great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, likewise. I love coming on the podcast and hope I can be back soon.
Of course. If you're interested in reading more of Allie's insights on this topic and others, you can access those on our Risk Intelligence platform. You can also sign up to receive our complimentary Risk News and Analysis Digest Risk Book. Simply register on our website, ranenetwork.com, to receive this intel directly to your inbox every weekday morning. We've also included the link to subscribe in the description of this episode. As always, thanks for joining us.